Everyone knows a true master assassin makes sure that the bodies are never even found. Mission accomplished, boys.
Need some help over here.
Oh. Dishonored Death of the Outsider was released on September 15th of 2017, which was little under a year after Dishonored 2 came out. Death of the Outsider was pitched as a DLC for Dishonored 2, but ended up being released as a standalone game. I'm not sure if the game was marketed as the series finale or not, but the fact is, shortly after this game came out, the developers confirmed that the Dishonored series was going on ice so that they could focus on other franchises, meaning that regardless, this is the final bit of content we ever got for the series. Now, I'm sure many of you have played one of the Dishonored games, and even more of you have at least heard of the franchise. And so today, I want to look into why the final entry in the franchise goes relatively untalked about. So without further ado, join me on this walk through the void as we find out why no one talks about Dishonored Death of the Outsider.
The world was wounded around you, and you carry the scars.
The story of Death of the Outsider is interesting because given that it's the conclusion to the franchise, the story actually has a lot riding on it this time around. And the Dishonored series has never been a very story-driven series, but their stories have been at least interesting as they have very unique settings and have really interesting world building in them. And Death of the Outsider sees us playing as Billy Lurk, who's one of Dowd's past apprentices, as she goes on one last mission with a now frail and dying Dowd to finally kill the Outsider and put an end to the death and destruction that he's brought to this world over the years. Both Dowd and Billy have been more side characters in the past, so it's great to actually learn more about who they are as people and why specifically they're the ones who decide to try and kill the Outsider and not someone like Corvo or Emily. Despite being the conclusion of the series, the game doesn't feature Corvo or Emily at all, which I find a bit disappointing, and the story in this one is fairly light overall, which isn't a huge deal given these games aren't really known for their stories in the first place, but it's still a disappointment nonetheless. Now, there isn't much to discuss as far as going scene by scene for this game, and all I really have to say in regards to the story is that I think it's serviceable, if not a bit generic, but it keeps the player's attention enough to get them to each new sandbox for them to play in, and for this type of game, that's all you can really ask for, honestly.
A dandelion. Must be the last one of the season. Oh,
Carl!
Easy, Frank.
He ruined our salad.
my mistake, fellas. My mistake. I mean, let me get up. No, seriously. Let me take care of this. What is this? Pine cones. Oh my goodness, they're my favorite. Delicious. Oh, that's a good eating. But don't let me hog them all up. Oh no, here you have some. Tasty, isn't it? Bon appetit.
Which brings me to the real tree of this series, the gameplay. The series is one of the only modern immersive sims out there, and Arcane makes each entry some of the best in the genre, and even a DLC like this is no exception to that rule. The game runs on the same engine and is set in the same city as Dishonored 2, so a lot of the mechanics and level design are similar, but the game tries a few new things out. Some are good, some are not so good. This time around, you have all your powers unlocked all at once, and you only have one level where you're forced to be powerless. This means no more hunting down runes to upgrade and unlock these powers, which is a bit of a shame, but Arcane made sure to jam each level with dozens of hidden bone charms to find, but this time with no heart to help, which means you really have to comb every inch of every level if you want to find them all. Also, to make sure the player really isn't bored when exploring each of these massive levels, they added in contracts, which are a sort of challenge for each mission to get some extra gold on the side to help unlock all those upgrades at the shop. The powers given to the player this time around are a teleport, a wall hack type ability, and then she has a disguise ability where she can take the appearance of any enemy as long as they aren't dead. Now all these sound similar or almost like a carbon copy of a previous power we've seen, but each has their own twist. Like the teleport can make an enemy explode if you teleport inside them, and it can be placed and teleport to whenever you want as long as you have line of sight of where you want to teleport to. The game also changed how the mana system works a bit by piecing it into 3 chunks that automatically refill, which means you no longer have to worry about using mana potions or just running out of mana altogether. Finally, the game got rid of the chaos system that would judge you and change the world based on how you played, meaning you can kill as many people as you want and you get the same outcome as someone who killed no one. Now with all these changes and additions aside, the general loop of the game is almost exactly like its base game Dishonored 2, which isn't a bad thing at all. Every level still allows you to do practically anything you can think of, and there are so few invisible walls, meaning you can pretty much do any crackhead shit you can think of to get through any situation however you want. The main positive I can say for this game, and even just the series as a whole, is the attention to detail in the level design and gameplay. It feels like the developers thought of everything when it comes to what you can do in the game and ways of approaching any given situation or area. The genre is called immersive sim for a reason. The systems in the game are so expansive and detailed that they even further immersed me into the game as they feel so similar to something in real life. It can almost be daunting at times when you're presented with so many options to use in any one situation. For example, you can use things like alcohol bottles as a way to lure or distract guards, or you could throw the bottle directly at a guard and make them puke or catch on fire. It all depends on what type of alcohol you're using, meaning each bottle of alcohol has a different interaction, and that's just so many options for something as simple as a bottle. Also, I know this is probably one of the most divisive parts of the game, but I actually really like the removal of the chaos system. I like morality systems in games, but in a game this ripe for experimenting and doing generally crackhead shit, I always found it a bit counterintuitive to lock a large portion of these tools and options for players that want the good ending by having to go pacifist. I've always been the type of person who, given the option to go good or evil, I can't force myself to go the evil route no matter how many times I've done the good playthrough. It's just not in my nature, so something like a chaos system makes it practically impossible for me to make use of any of the lethal options the game gives me. So when it came out that they were going to be getting rid of the chaos system for this DLC, I felt like that was such a good decision for the franchise so they could really let everyone stretch their legs in the game and get wacky with it. I just don't see why a game should punish the player for making full use of all the tools that it gives you. And yes, I understand this also means that the narrative doesn't have the whole high and low chaos system to it, which is a bit of a shame, but if people are really that attached to the system, I could see a way that they could have made it so that they could have had their cake and ate it too. They could have just tweaked the chaos system to be something more like the Hitman games, where killing innocent people counts as bad points, but killing actually bad people such as your targets or cult members was not penalized. You get your chaos system without completely blocking off half the arsenal for players by sticking to low chaos, but since that's not what happened, I'd much rather have no chaos system than have the current way the chaos system works in these games. I'm also just a huge fan of all the streamlining they did for this game, like taking away the need to upgrade powers and having auto-regening mana. By removing these systems, I feel like it allows the player to experience the game at its fullest form from the second they get control of the character to the minute the credits are rolling. Like, I found in the first few levels of the past games, they felt the most expansive yet the most restricted to the player, as you only have a few powers and they have no upgrades, meaning the beginning levels feel really drawn out as you have to spend the most time navigating them while not really being able to experiment at all with them. And lastly, I'd just like to give a quick nod to the voice actors in this game, as the 3 main cast members, Billy, Dowd, and the Outsider, really knocked it out of the park with their voice lines in my opinion. Sure, the story, like I've said multiple times now, isn't the best, the voice actors really save it from being full-on campy. Like, the banter between Billy and Dowd really sell the relationship and almost give a feeling of like a father and daughter relationship. And the outsider really plays up his menacing presence, almost like he's a super old wise man, but in all the wrong ways. So clearly there's plenty to love about Death of the Outsider, as it's simply more Dishonored, but that's also the problem. It's simply more the same and nothing more. Now I know I just spent the past few minutes telling you how the open nature of the game is easily its greatest strength, which is still true, but I did find, especially as the game went on, the maps started to feel a little too daunting to me, to the point of honestly being a bit overwhelming. Every new level brings so many new places to check out and encounters to play around with that, at least for me, it makes me feel like it's a little much, which often resulted in me just trying to do the first and simplest way of getting through any situation to avoid being overwhelmed. And by the end of the game, which this game already isn't long to begin with, I found myself just rushing through the last few levels as fast as possible because I couldn't be bothered anymore to really take the time and explore everything, as it felt way too time consuming for very little reward. Also, on the topic of the levels, like I said before, this game runs on the same engine and takes place in the same city as Dishonored 2, meaning that there's a lot of reused assets from the base game, and some of the city locations feel very samey from the locations you visit in the base game, which is pretty hard to swallow when you're paying $30, so you're expecting a new experience, and you see so many things that were in the base game, or at least remind you of a level from the base game. Like, the base game had the time travel, which has some of the most creative and unique level design of the series. Death of the Outsider, on the other hand, plays it very safe with some city streets, some of which you're visiting multiple times, and then you usually have one large structure that you explore in each level, either being a type of mansion or a high security facility, and that's it. No interesting game mechanics or twists on the formula to change things up. The last level is the most interesting, as you get a large portion of it in the void, but even then you just end up realizing it's the first half of the level in reverse with a slightly different coat of paint on it to make it look like the void. And in the end, I couldn't help but feel like the level of creativity in the levels should have been the reverse of what it really is, with the base game being more interesting than the DLC. They also play it super safe with the powers, as most of Billy's powers are just small tweaks on old powers that we've used before. In some cases, her versions just feel like downgrades of the previous iterations. With the developers experimenting with a lot of other aspects of the game, it doesn't make sense why they would play it so safe when it comes to the powers, which is arguably one of the most defining aspects of the Dishonored franchise. This would have been the time to try something completely new and give players something they can really play around with and experiment with. And this sentiment carries over to the bone charms as well, as there are so many times I found repeats of the same bone charm, and none of the bone charms really change how any abilities work or how you would even play the game like some did in Dishonored 2. I found the contracts were a bit more rigid in their structure than I would have liked as well. For example, in the first real mission of the game, you can take a contract to kill a mime, but you have to make it look like an accident by throwing him over a bridge, which is a common suicide location. And yes, you have a lot of options on how to get his body to that bridge and over the bridge, but the fact still remains it has to be that bridge, which is a bit of a letdown to me, as I could really see the potential for this system to be a real amazing addition to the series. Now, I know this is probably a bit of a pipe dream, but just imagine for a second if the game had the ability to know how objects were arranged or where a body died to know if it could be perceived as a suicide or an accident, such as what if you threw him down a long flight of stairs that could likely kill someone and could happen as easily as someone making one wrong step, or what if you threw him in an alleyway and then put a bottle next to him to indicate he may have drunk himself to death. And from a coding standpoint, I'm sure all this would be a complete nightmare, but the game has such an emphasis on storytelling through the world that I felt like the contracts could have been an even better way for the player to interact with this way of storytelling by making their own. The contracts are a nice addition, and I don't think they necessarily hurt the game in their current state, as they're a neat little challenge you can do for yourself to get a little cash on the side, but you never have to. But I could just see the potential of what they could have been, and I couldn't help but dream. Now on the story side of things, I found the overall length of the story to be a big letdown, especially for what's supposed to be the finale of the series, which means there's a lot of answers that we need to get about the world and the characters that have been built up over the franchise. I think the story does a good job at expanding on what the Outsider is and what the Void is, but as far as finishing up the story of Corvo and Emily, the game just doesn't even bother and doesn't touch them at all, despite them having a huge connection to the Void and to the Outsider himself. So it's a bit odd that we never really get to know how they feel about Billy trying to kill the Outsider, which would mean that Corvo and Emily would also lose their powers with his death, which they've used these powers to defend their kingdom multiple times at this point, so I feel like that's kind of something that needs to be addressed. Ultimately though, the game tried to do some new things for the franchise, and not all of them really stuck the landing, but I'm glad that even for a smaller scale game like this, Arcane still wants to try new things and try and innovate on their formula. I just wish that, all of it had been for the better. When looking at reviews for this game, a large portion of the players seem to share the sentiment that it's more of Dishonored 2, but a bit watered down and not as original with its levels, which, depending on the person, was a deal breaker for them. People also seem to share in my sentiment that the story suffered with the absence of Corvo and Emily, as Billy just isn't as interesting as either of them. Don't get me wrong, Death of the Outsider is a great game and one worthy of the Dishonored franchise, but it's definitely a bit rough around the edges, and it's definitely my least favorite of the franchise. And in the end, we'll never truly get the answer to why no one talks about this game anymore. But if I had to give it my best guess, I feel that having this game be a standalone game for something that's essentially just an expansion was this game's main downfall. The game is really short and clearly a much smaller scope than the past two games, but when it releases as its own game and has a $30 price tag to match, the game gets compared to products of much higher caliber. If the game had just been a DLC that was attached to Dishonored 2, I feel this would have gotten much better recognition and much higher praise in general, because for a DLC, this is quite substantial and far more generous than most companies nowadays. They did a similar thing for Dowd's DLC in the first game, and that's regarded as possibly being better than the base game. Plus, if Death of the Outsider had been put into Dishonored 2, then I feel more people would try it, since they don't really have to boot up a separate game just to play it, since it'll just be sitting there at the main menu when they're finished with the base game. Also, this game leans heavily on knowing the story of Dishonored 2, and even knowing the first game, as you need to know who Dowd and Billy are, so it's even more baffling as to why this game was put out as its own title rather than being attached to the game that it's so heavily drawing from. In the end though, the core gameplay of this game still makes it one of the best immersive sims out there, and even being the worst entry in the franchise does not make this game bad at all. It's just a shame though, as even though it seems that this was planned as the final entry in the franchise, no matter what, the poor reception and sales likely means that we may never even see a revival of this series down the line, which is just a real shame, since as far as open world gameplay and level design goes, there really is nothing like Dishonored on the market right now. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. I hope you liked the video. If you did, please leave a like, as it really helps me out, and if you didn't, then leave a dislike and let me know in the comments what I can do better. And if you really liked my content, subscribe if you want to see more of it in the future, and if so, I'll see you guys in the next video.